Good morning, and thank you very much, everyone, for being here. Today, we are thrilled to have Micheala Giorcelli joining us from UCLA. Micheala's broad area of research is economic history, but she has worked on a number of great topics. And if you are not familiar with her research, I would invite you to take a close look at Micheala's website, and I'm sure I can guarantee you will be amazed by her wonderful work and papers. Today, she will present groundbreaking research on the relationship between scientific and cultural changes using data derived from text analysis. Micheala is happy to take questions during the talk. So if you have any question, please feel free to ask. Other than that, if you don't have question, please keep your mic on mute so that the seminar can proceed without any problem. So without any further ado, let me leave the floor to Micheala. Micheala, thank you for joining us, and you have 1 hour until 10 a.m.
Okay, hi everyone. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Claudio, for the invitation and for this generous introduction. I'm very glad to be virtually here. I wish I were in Melbourne, but I'm happy to be virtually here to present my research on scientific progress and cultural changes. So the motivation of this research is that scientific progress is a key driver of innovation and growth on the one hand, but on the other hand, we know that culture affect economic outcomes and economic growth. There have been historically, there have been these idea that the action that are performed by the collective man have an effect on the conception of world, on the idea of equality, for instance, across different societies. Has been inspirational of many important historical events, but also of some crucial economic events. For instance, the Industrial Revolution that has shaped the way in which we intended the economy and the world today. And Joel Mokyr has widely written about the role of culture and what people believe and to what extent it affected the development of the Industrial Revolution. More recently, some works have tried to quantify the effect of culture, thinking about belief, consistency with certain values, and estimate their effect on a number of different economic outcomes, especially labor market outcomes, considering how personal responsibility of work progress can affect these labor market indicator and money in general, society well-being. However, what we think it's a little bit missing in this literature is a deep understanding of the interaction between the scientific and cultural change. So do scientific and cultural change develop independently of each other, or are they related? And if they are related, we should imagine additional channels through which culture and science may jointly affect economic growth. Moreover, little we know about the role of elites, in the sense that are scientific discoveries only important to a specific part of the society, or do they diffuse and in a way affect the popular culture? Again, Mokyr has talked about two important aspects of these relations between science and culture. One is related to scientific progress, in the sense that the scientific progress led to the selection and the retention of ideas, which can contribute in the long run to determine growth trajectories on the one hand, but he has also identified some important figures that are the so-called culture entrepreneurs that are individuals whose beliefs are different from the given set of beliefs in a given society that can be changed, and their role is important in order to change the broader conception of culture, which in turn can have important economic consequences. Important examples are Bacon, Newton, Copernicus, Galileo, and Darwin, who is going to be the major focus of our research. So the ultimate question is, does scientific progress affect cultural change? On one end, we can think that the relationship between science and culture is very strict, in the sense that the absorption of scientific discovery by the broad culture facilitate the government from reflection and choice. So it's not only important that some scientific turning points are reached, but it's also important that their effect spill over into the broader cultural perception. However, studying the interplay between science, culture, public discourse, and sentiment from a quantitative point of view is challenging for a number of reasons. So first of all, it's very hard to have a measurement on large scale. It's hard to have a more comprehensive analysis that move from some specific case studies, and it's also hard to come up with a long time horizon. Moreover, establishing a causality is challenging, in the sense that we can have a reverse causality problem here. On the one hand, we can think that scientific discoveries affect the cultural perception and society culture and beliefs, but also the reverse is true. And again, Mukir has extensively written about it, the fact that some societies are more open to adopt changes, cultural changing, for instance, as England was in the mid 19th century, can help the scientific discoveries and scientific advancement. So how do we try to solve these empirical challenges? So first of all, we focus on one major scientific breakthrough, that is Darwin theory of evolution. And in doing so, we identify a natural variation. Specifically, we use the fact that the exact publication of Darwin's theory was unplanned. And so this gives us some natural variation in estimating the effect that his theory had on the culture. We perform a text analysis using a large corpora of literacy work before and after the Darwin breakthrough, and we specifically adopted two different approaches. On the one hand, we use just a simple frequency approach. We look at how the frequency of certain words and phrases that are related to the major concept of Darwin theory diffuse before and after its theory. The idea of this analysis is to understand whether some concepts were already in the cultural discourse and were formalized and put in a scientific framework by Darwin, versus the fact that these scientific ideas were not present and were actually diffused by Darwin's work. And we also take another approach looking at the semantic and sentiment evolution of the meaning of these terms over time, in order to see if not only some words were introduced, but also the way in which they were considered and perceived by a society as change. in response to Darwin theory. So very briefly, in terms of the literature and methodological background, there have been a number of qualitative studies that aim at understanding the relationship between science and society. They aim at studying the impact of science on literature, but also the impact of literary and philosophical roots of scientific ideas. But as I was saying before, they mostly focus on specific case studies, and so they cannot draw conclusion on the large scale. There is also an important part of economic history that has been devoted to study the effect of science and culture on economic progress. The work on Micheala about the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution happening in England because the culture was more open, more prone to accept some important changes, has been a very influential one, but also Gallagher may closely try to study this important relationship. We also, I think we also contribute to the literature that study the digital humanities and distant readings, in the sense that we can use evidence from digitizing text analysis that not only gives us information on the use of some specific words, but also on their semantical evolution, and by using differences in the publication of Darwin's main work, but also on when his work was translated in other languages, we can also understand how, like, the spatial diffusion of this concept, and the fact that we have millions of books that are turned into data, we can allows us to identify broader pattern in literacy. Sorry. We can also look at some culturonomics, in a way, ideas, in the sense that the distance reading of the analysis allows us to estimate cultural trends, so how ideas and topics were popular, what was the adoption rate, and also how and also looking at the difference between the more cultural debate, as could be represented by fictional, non-fictional works, versus we also collected data and do the same analysis on the parliament, both in the UK and the US, debate transcripts, in order to see to what extent these ideas also spill over into the political debate. And finally, I think that we contribute, and this is probably the main aspect, the aspect of major interest for today's seminar, to the increasing idea of transforming text into data and studying them in economics. In this case, I think that our innovation is that we can use this data to build up on what previously was mostly studied in terms of case studies, having tried at least to make some causal estimation. And in this case, we are contributing to a growing literature that use text analysis to better understand the media behavior, political economy, diffusion of new ideas, managerial connection, and finance. So, as an overview for the talk today, I will start with some historical episode about the Darwin theory of evolution. So how it was formed, how it developed, how it was different from previous scientific theory. I will describe our data and our identification, our main analysis and findings, and then some conclusion and possible direction for future works. So in terms of the first aspect, so the development of Darwin theory of evolution, first of all, let me underscore that, as written in his obituary, Darwin theory of evolution is considered the book that has worked so great and so rapidly into revolution in science, so made so a deep impression on the general mind. The characteristic of Darwin that is universally considered among the greatest and most broadly influential scientific achievement in history has some important characteristics. First of all is that it is a major turning point in the scientific debate, but also that is a book written and taught in order to have a large diffusion across society. So it was not just a scientific publication taught to be read and understood by a limited number of people. There is a widespread narrative evidence on the influence of Darwin theory on literature, the perception of God, nature, the absence of racial differences, but there is lack of quantification of how important. So we all agree that Darwin theory was important, but to what extent it was important and really affect the scientific and the social thoughts. So what we want to do is establish more in general its influence on culture and society phenomena. Establish a causality, so what was already in there before Darwin and what was brought in there by Darwin, and isolating specific concepts or ideas that were new and influential in this debate. So very briefly, the Darwinian theory, except for its importance and diffusion, is also some interesting features that help us in developing our empirical analysis. The first thing is that the Origin of Species was published in 1959, but it's a publication that was not entirely planned or anticipated. Specifically, Darwin realized that there was another scientist, Wallace, that was working on similar topics. And so he had to rush in order to publish it, and so we use this natural variation in the exact time in which the Darwin theory was published as a natural experiment. In this sense, we can claim that Darwin did not wait to publish until specific society conditions were met, but it's just published his theory as soon as possible. Moreover, it was one of the theories that got an immediate attention and diffusion. It was easily included in very prestigious scientific meetings, got a lot of review in the press, so it was not just in the more narrow scientific or academic work. And this makes reasonable and doable to explore what were the interplay with the broader cultural discourse and perception. The basic idea of this theory and the view in which it was innovative and a breakthrough compared to the previous theory is that so first of all, Darwin started from the analysis on a way of real data. So he was looking at some natural phenomenon in order to find some regularly, what he found out is that overall the different species were over-reproducing, which meant that the survival chances of each single individual were overall small. And so, said it differently, individuals were competing for scarce resources. However, within each species, there could be some random variation, and these random variations, some random variation, are more adaptable to a given environment than others. And so they gave an advantage to some individuals of a given species compared to others. These variations are then transmitted. There is an intergenerational transmission of these variation, and the natural selection works in the sense that the individuals that have these random characteristics that are more suitable, more adaptable to the environment in which they live have higher chances of survival. And these overall, over time, determine the emergence of new species when the variation gradually became large enough, either in the same or in different environments. And so what Darwin claimed in a very famous citation is that all living species are descendant of ancestral species, and they're different from the previous days due to some cumulative changing in the genetic composition of a population. So this is of course, particularly important in the sense that it was considered a completely change of perspective with the creationist idea of the world being created by a God and having been the same since the creation to the present day. Okay, so in terms of data, how we proceed. Our analysis mostly rely on Google Books. Google Books as an effort started back in 2002 by Google, whose idea was to scan and digitize using the optical character recognition all the available book in a word, thanks to partnership with publisher, authors, and libraries. So, so far, the corpus of book digitized reached 8 million, that are 6%, roughly 6% of all the books ever published, and we can count on around 500 billion words only in the English corpus. From the Google book, it is possible to create the n-gram dataset, meaning that the text on each book is organized in pages that are then cut in n-grams of different size. The idea is that, for instance, 1 n-gram includes the single word that is there in a book, with its frequency. The n-gram are combination of n words and their frequency. And so what we are specifically using in this paper is the frequency from 1 and 2 n-grams data for each year, and I will provide more. I will be more precise on what I mean by this in a couple of slides. Well, when I introduce our empirical strategy. Thanks to n-gram, there are two major things that we can do. One is looking at the text, at the frequency of the words, and their semantic association. We can also distinguish fiction and non-fictional works, but we don't have periodicals in the Google book so far. And we start with the entire period 1820, 1899, with the Origin of Spices being published in 1859, but we can also restrict our sample to some specific decades to have an idea of how the change of these ideas over time worked. We also, okay, so this gives an idea of how the Darwin theory spill over in a way in the society, but of course, the importance of major scientific and cultural revolution can also mediate by the political debate. So in order to get a measure of this aspect, we also rely on US congressional records and UK Parliament debates that are the verbatim account of all the discussion on the floor of the Houses and Senate. And this allows us to estimate to do the frequency analysis on whether the Darwin theory also spill over in the political debate and not just in the cultural discourse. Of course, sample size of the congressional records and the parliamentary debates is much smaller, and so for a reason that I will explain during the talk, we cannot perform the semantic analysis on this corpus, and so we will only focus on the frequency analysis. Okay, so in terms of identification.
Sorry, can I ask just a quick question on the data? So it's 6% of all books published. Do you have any idea on any data? Probably we'll talk about this later. On what's the if this sample is representative of the underlying population of books, or certain books are more likely to be in there than others, and how that somehow relates.
So this is definitely a good point. So of course, there is some selection, and it is likely that the scientific books are more likely to be included in the Google Books. We, in order to deal with this, we do several checks in the paper. So first of all, we first define some words that are specifically, that are like scientific works related to Darwin theory, but we also look at some other scientific works that are not related to his theory, and so there is no reason why they would change between before and after 1859. And we can also look at some other scientific concepts that are not related at all to the Darwinian theory, and we see how they change before and after. And the other thing that we do is that looking at translation, in the sense that the Origin of Spices was published in English and then was translated in other languages later on, and so we can also see whether the diffusion of this specific concept start after the publication date in a given language. So I think that this analysis should not rely on the fact that some books have a higher likelihood of being represented, but in general, as a disclaimer, for sure, the fact that the book is still available, printed somewhere, it could have been digitized, introduced some selections, so we don't think that there is kind of random representation of all the books ever published. And you can think that books that are still available today were more popular, more important, and more influential in a way. What I hope we are able to convince you is that is not differentially affect our quote treatment and control group.
Thank you. And then one short clarification probably. So this method that you developed in this paper, which is applied to Darwin's theory, can be more broadly applied to any author, to my understanding, right? As long as we don't care about the causal effect. If we want to measure diffusion of a certain theory by a certain author, this methodology will do it.
Yes, exactly. And so, can I defer the question 1 second? Because, okay.
Sure.
Okay, so here in terms of identification in our empirical idea, no, because it's just the answer to what you were asking. So in order to, so in principle, our analysis could be done by looking at the frequencies of all the words that have ever been written, ever made it to Google Books. But of course, it's important to in a way, isolating words that are specific to the Darwin theory. So we look at the 6 word recognized words or expression that are the closest related to Darwin theory, that are evolution, selection, survival, adaptation, competition, and natural selection. And these are considered the key Darwinian concept and also are words that have very specific and well-defined meaning. And so this, of course, similar reasoning could be applied to other theories identifying what are the most characteristic words or expressions that are associated to that specific theory. Then, in order to construct our empirical analysis, and this is the part that is more specific and more related to our case, we can exploit 3 sources of variation. The first one is that, as I was saying before, we think that the publication of the origin of species is as good as random and also had a rapid diffusion. So this allows us to look at pre-post 1859 in the change in use and meaning of concepts, and also in understanding if even one of these 6 words was in use before Darwin theory, whether Darwin theory changed its meaning or the way in which it made part of the public concourse. So I think there is a question.
Question by Sepia,
Yeah, I have 2 questions. One is a little bit stupid, I think. When you use this word, you cannot use the name Darwin, whether they cite the author.
We also do that. We also
okay.
Yes, it's so we didn't consider it as a classic expression of his theory because we wanted to take a step back, but we can also do the word Darwin, and of course it started being used widely after 1859, wide before it's basically non-existent. Yeah.
And then I have another question, maybe you will answer later. How do you try to distinguish between the Darwin theory and the Wallace theory? Because you mentioned that the reason why Darwin rushed it was because there was already Wallace. So how can you try to distinguish whether...
So the theory was not published yet, but we got to know that also Wallace was working on something similar, and so he wanted to anticipate in order not to lose his advantage. So at the time, so in 1959, basically Darwin theory only was published. In later years, I agree with you that we can have a confounding factor. So that's why we use translation. The fact that only when Darwin theory was translated in other languages, this concept should become available to the broader discourse compared to the books that were written in English. And what we find, I will show the results later, is that the effects are pretty similar in countries like France and Germany, whose level of development was pretty advanced. So we can also look at some other countries that were much more backward, like Russia and China, for instance, and we see that the diffusion of concept is much slower then. So I think that our theory holds among countries with a similar level of development, but of course, the importance of these concepts also depends on the level of development of the country. We identify as countries that already had industrial revolution versus countries that didn't, as an important difference between the two.
Thank you.
Okay, so
can I ask a quick question? It's a technical one. I believe that most of the books on Google have been translated in crowdsourcing. So they use CAPTCHA to ask users to translate words that weren't clear or translate words from other languages. Would that be a problem? Like mistranslation maybe, or losing a little bit the meaning of the word from one language to another?
I think that as long as the overall number of words that is available is large enough, so for most languages like French, Germany, Italian, and so on, it shouldn't be a problem. It could be an issue in interpreting our results for languages like Russian or Chinese that could be a little bit more controversial. And so, yes, this might be a caveat in interpreting the results. I agree.
Thank you.
Okay, so as I was saying, the first as good as random variation that we're going to use is before after 1859. Then we also use control words. So we select the 100 words in terms of count that are the most frequent to the theory of evolution, but they are not specifically related to it. For instance, nature, that is widely used in the theory of evolution, but it's also a word that could be used in other scientific publication, or more in general in the public discourse. And finally, we distinguish between fiction and non-fiction books, in the sense that this should allow us to control for any potential bias in the corpus over time, as Claudio was asking before. And we can also distinguish the public discourse from the social imaginary by exploiting the role of novel in the 19th century. Okay, so the first set of results that I'm gonna present are based on the frequency of word and phrases analysis. And the main analysis that we're doing is looking at the 6 Darwinian concept versus the control words, distinguish between fiction and non-fiction books. So first of all, we focus on the 6 words that are distinctive characteristics of the Darwinian expression, that are natural selection, evolution, survival, selection, competition, and adaptation. And so, as we can see, after so for instance, if we focus on natural selection, we can see that the frequency was extremely low until 1959, and then it started being used more and more over a century until 1899. We observe a similar pattern for evolution and survival. In the middle, we have also the word competition that was in use even before Darwin, but whose use definitely increased after the publication of The Origin of the Species, while for the other 2 words, selection and adaptation, we find that there was an increasing trend, so these words were using more, also because a larger number of books made it to our corpora over time, but it doesn't seem to be a structural break or like a difference after 1859. And I think that in this case, the fact that we can use the n-grams aggregation helps a lot, in the sense that natural selection starts being used like the association of the 2 words that is typical in Darwin started being used much more after 1959 than just the word selection that you can think can be broadly used or is less distinctive of Darwin theory per se. Then then we look at what happened to some other generic words. These are the words that are selected among the 100 most used words that are not distinctive of Darwinian theory, but they are largely used in the origin of species. And we can see that, for instance, for the terms nature, number, life, animal, flower, or plants, we don't observe any significant change after 1859. So this suggests that indeed the diffusion of the Darwinian concept mattered a lot, and they did so after 1859. We can
Micheala, on this one, sorry, on this one, going back to Silvia's question, probably you could do the same graph, the next chart, using some words which were only used by Wallace. In that case,
I was thinking the same.
In that case, you shouldn't observe anything happening around the time when.
In 1859, yeah.
Yes, when the work by Darwin was published. I think there is also a comment by Lam. Lam, do you want to make your comment? It's in the chat, but probably it's easier.
Oh, sorry, I missed it.
Lam, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, okay.
Oh, I'm here. Yeah. I think it might be. Because this is truly eye-opening. I think I wrote the question up already, so it might be easier to just read it and then share your insight. Oh.
Sorry again?
Oh, the question is in the chat, so maybe I'll just read it. So
okay, sorry, it's in the chat. Sorry.
Yeah.
I missed that.
No.
Besides the scientific contribution by scientists and contribution of European, were also important during technological progress. Incorporating science into a fascination and maybe you can trace the cultural change, the quality of craftsmen in the UK. This way, the company more educated in science. Yes. So I think that this is a great point, and is definitely something we are thinking about, because my specific insight, and the reason why we decided to study the Darwinian theory, despite I think we all agreed that it was important, it was a major turning point, is that it was one of the first theory that was not developed just for scientists or just for the narrow academic work, but it was thought to be read also by a non-technical audience. And so that's why we think that it's particularly well suited to study its diffusion on culture. So yes, I totally agree with your point, and I think that understanding how this could develop craftsmen in their job, like the quality of their job, could be particularly important, because it definitely played a fundamental role in the Industrial Revolution. Yeah.
A quick follow-up question. I also wonder whether it might be hard to find the data, but all this discussion about diffusion knowledge and also like progress, people's change in knowledge society, right? By people like Habermas, right? Emphasize the role of letters, right? The role of letters written by prominent intellectuals when they communicate to others. And then this actually, their day of social media, right? This is actually where to shape a lot of people believe. That's why in many, right, in the United States, the college is called College of Arts, Letters, and Sciences. I just wonder whether I've not thought about looking into letters.
Yes, so this is a great point. I agree, it would be super interesting to look at. Yeah.
Thank you.
No, thank you very much. Okay, so we also we also estimate the coefficient on each time trend, and we do that by looking at the 1820, 1859, so like the pre-period versus our post-period, and indeed we find that all the words associated with the Darwinian theory looks to be above the 45 degree line. The other the next step that we do is inserting these words in kind of a difference in differences analysis, in which we look at the Darwinian word as our treatment group, all the other generic word as a control group, and in this definitive we have a dummy for the Darwinian word, and specifically we group them into different decades through this interaction. And so the coefficients of interest are the interaction between each of the decades before and after the Darwinian theory and with the dummy for the words that are in the 6 categories that we just described. And our results seems to confirm our previous findings, in the sense that there is no systematic difference in the frequency of use of these words in the 3 decades before the publication of The Origin of Species. Then we have an increase of the use of these words. This becomes significant basically 1 decade after the publication of The Origin of Species, and the effects remain significant and persistent until the end of our sample. An important addition to our analysis is looking at what happened in other languages. So this allows us to solve some of the potential issue with the data that you have already underscored, but also to understand whether the publication of scientific theories are related to the overall economic development of openness to new ideas that a society can have. Of course, a caveat in the interpretation of this analysis is that we cannot claim that the publication date in other languages is random. So you can think that a book is published first in the areas in which there is more interest for a given theory, or for more in general scientific theories. But with this caveat in mind, we can see that the Darwinian theory was published basically a couple of years after the English language in Germany and in France, and that some words, for instance, natural selection, evolution, competition, and also adaptation start really to increase after the publication, while there was not that much use of these words later on. We can find a similar pattern in Italian and Spanish, even though the publication in Spanish happened a little bit later, and we can think about these 2 countries as latecomers in the Industrial Revolution. And finally, we can also look at Russian and Chinese. In this case, the pattern is much less clear. This could depend by the fact that these countries were more closer. They were still with a federal system, basically, until the beginning of the 20th century, the 21st century, but also by the fact that the books that make it to the Google collection in Russian and Chinese are much fewer, and there could be, as Marco said, some translation problems. So I think these results should be interpreted with granum of salis, but overall it looks like that there is an association between the publication of the translation of the Darwinian theory and the diffusion of its concept. Of course, the overall acceptance of cultural topics is related to the political debate. And so in the last part of this analysis, we look at the frequencies in the US Congress and in the UK Parliament. And the results are less neat than for Google Books. So one caveat is that, of course, the corpus of data we can rely on is much more limited. And so our analysis has a little bit less power. But it looks like that some concepts like evolution, survival, really start being used more and more, at least in the US after the publication of The Origin of Species, even though this increase happened with some lags compared to the original publication of the book, meaning that probably there is some lag between the publication of a book and its relevance for the political debate. And if again we look at these analysis in a different framework, what we find is that this lag between the publication of the Darwinian theory and diffusion in the political debate is confirmed. Basically, of course, the fact that we have much larger standard errors depend by the fact that our sample here it's smaller, but the effects seems to become significant roughly at the end of our sample, and this may suggest that the cultural diffusion is faster than the political diffusion, and probably the cultural diffusion is a precondition for a political diffusion. Finally, the last analysis that we do is a semantic analysis. And we divided this analysis into parts. We look at the semantical evolution and the sentiment analysis. So the semantic association is based on the techniques of the word vectors and word embedding that use distributional natural language processing technique in order to have words that are distributed as vectors. And here the idea is not to take a word in isolation, but to infer its meaning from the words that are right before or right after the word in a sentence, and then analyze whether the meaning is more or less similar to the focal one. Just to give you a simple idea on how it works, so basically there are some words that are put in a vector, and these are basically all the words that could be found in a text. Then they are embedded in an B per N matrix. This is the number of words by the number of times a word is repeated in the book. These create a hidden layer that means they're converted in the context matrix, and here we can create a vector, a probability vector, that in which its entry is the predicted co-occurrence of two words within a window of words before and after the word itself. We can play a little bit with the number of words before and after. We do that between 2 and 5 words. So we look at 2 words before and after the word we're interested in, or the 5 words before and after the word we're interested in. The idea of this measure is then to getting a synthetic measure of similarity, looking at the cousin between the distance of the 2 words. So the idea is that the more similar the 2 vectors are, the smaller should be the angle between them, and so the higher should be the cousin. If we look at the semantic association of the words that are the largely diffused in the Darwinian theory, we can see that the association of words like life, adaptation, life and competition, life and struggle significantly increased after 1859, but also existence and struggle, survival and competition seems to increase after 1859. Another thing that we can do is taking a little bit different approach. It's more like looking at the data and let the data speak, and looking at how the top 10 most similar words per decade to the word of adaptation have been changed. And we do that for the 6 key concepts in the Darwinian theory. For instance, we can see that adaptation moved from 1820 to 1900 from being mechanic to become more organic related. And the word similarly, the word competition, we can look at the word evolution that moves to be more inorganic, to more related to organic and social concept, which again is consistent with our idea that there is this diffusion of social ideas. And similar, the word selection moves more from a choice to a dynamic. So this idea that there is a dynamic adaptation and improvement of the individual's characteristics. Finally, we can look at the word survival, and this is very interesting because basically before 1859 we could not find any semantic association. So the number of times survival is used before 1859 is too low for us to perform every analysis. But I think it's very interesting to see how over time survival and fitness become strongly associated, and basically the lag between the use of fittest word and the other most strongly associated word with survival has dramatically increased up to 1900. Finally, we can perform a sentiment analysis that is interesting in the sense that allows us to give us a quantification of the association between two words, moving from two extreme of a particular concept. And specifically, the 3 dimensions that we use are important, unimportant, bad and good, moral and immoral. And the idea is to compute the difference of the word vector for each antonym pairs and do an average of those concepts. And so what we find is that there is a higher association of evolution, selection and competition to the word important, to the word moral, especially for evolution and survival, and also to the idea of good for evolution and competition, while survival seems to more associated to a negative concept, which is again consistent with the Darwinian theory. Okay, so I have 1 minute left, so I think it's a good time to draw some conclusion. What we do in this paper is studying the effect of the diffusion of the Darwin origin of species on the cultural debate. What we find is that there was an impact both on the diffusion of certain concept ideas, but also on change of our meanings. Overall, the effect has some similarities between fictional, non-fictional literature and the political debate. even though there is definitely some lag in the political debate showing that the effects emerge, but after a while, so the cultural diffusion is probably faster. So in terms of the contribution of this analysis to the existing literature, I think that this represents the first large sample evidence of how scientific progress affect culture. We also claim to have a methodological contribution, so use specifically to use the digital text analysis in order to look at the impact of a major scientific discoveries, not just on the lead, but on the broad cultural discourse. And finally, final remark of what the next steps could be. So first of all, it's possible to refine or extend the selection of words, phrase, and association, but it would be also interesting to look at the evolution of other concepts that are associated, like Wallace concept, for instance, and how they diffuse over time. But more in general, in future work, we also would like to go beyond diving and using these techniques to look, for instance, at other cultural entrepreneurs, other principle that constitute major scientific breakthrough, but also to what extent some international policies, for instance, the Marshall Plan promoted diffusion of North American culture, or like how the culture, the cyberculture and the counterculture diffuse in the Silicon Valley in these days. So I think that this methodology could be applied to a number of other aspects and can definitely improve our understanding of the relationship between science and culture. So I'm out of time, so I'll stop you there. Thank you very much for coming, and I'm more than happy to take any other questions if there is any.
Right. Thank you, Micheala, and thank you everyone for being here. I think that we are, as Micheala mentioned, we are 2 minutes late, so we will end the seminar here. Please join me in thanking Micheala, and if you have more questions, please stay and feel free to ask. Thank you, Micheala. Thank you very much.
Hi, Micheala.
Hi.
I have a question. So the whole thing's really interesting. Now, I'm wondering if you have some sense of how widely read each of the books that you're look at are, I guess maybe proxy with like number of editions printed or something. So I'm just getting at like the idea of so you see that these words are used more, but how are they used more also in the books that are just, I guess, more widely read or like more popular books?
So unfortunately, a problem that we have with the Google book is that we can look at the overall number of words that are used in the books that are collected, but we cannot look at the specific books in which they are reported. So unfortunately, we cannot see. It would have been super cool to see which specific books were citing specific words if they associated, because you can think that there is a transmission effect. So maybe some books are using Darwinian theories and they are kind of an intermediate channel for its large scale diffusion, but unfortunately it's something that at the moment we cannot do.
I see. So they don't have any sort of category, like any category, like final category of.
No.
I see.
No. And also something that I should have mentioned when I was talking about translation, we look at languages, but we don't know the specific country in which the book was published. Of course, for some languages like Italian, German, they're not speak worldwide, so it's kind of easier, but looking at Spanish, for instance, we're looking at Spain, of course, but also all the South America. So these this could also play a role. We don't think that there are huge differences in the translation date, but in principle, it's possible.
I see. Yeah, thank you.
Any other question? So I actually had one, Micheala. So can you look also at the effects on words which are probably important for industrial revolutions after the publication, or to the idea that these scientific breakthroughs can then be somehow important for following economic development?
This is a good point. It's something that we're not doing it here, but I think it would be interesting. So the first industrial revolution actually happened a little bit earlier than Darwin theory, but definitely not the second industrial revolution in the US that started in 1870. So we can definitely look at whether there is a relationship between second industrial revolution words and Darwinian words. Yes, I think it's a great point.
And one more thing I was thinking is probably in some countries there was some censorship or something. You can talk to Sasha about this. Yes, some paper on censorship. They might explain why certain words were not translated or did not diffuse as much, probably in Italy or Spain. I don't know. So probably Sasha would be able.
Yeah. And this is, of course, it could be related to the degree of industrial development of these countries compared to France and Germany, but also to the the role of church, of God, that is more predominant in some countries relative to others. Yes, absolutely.
Did you have a question, Byron?
Yeah. So there's a question. Ask it goes first.
There is another question here.
Yes. Is there the scope to use the methodology to compare different ideas and measure which one was more influential on the subsequent discourse? Yes. So I think that in principle, we can use also this methodology to do that. But probably for other theories, in the sense that it's definitely Darwinian theory was one of the most largely diffused. So comparing it with any other theories make it hard to understand whether it was more diffused because it was just this theory, or because it was more influential on other theories. So I think it can be done for theories that were more similar in their scope. Yes, it would be possible to compare the words that are more specific to different theories to those and do this analysis.
So Micheala, just one question. This is truly fascinating. I just wonder whether or not you, for some of the more influential books, whether you have data about the approximate number of sales that might give you, like, how many copies were printed. They might give you a sense about how influential, right? Because ultimately, the number of people who read the book that matters, right? So I think that some of those data may be available in some of the most influential books or novels or things like that.
Yes, this is a good point. It's something we can look at. I don't think we can do it for all the books because unfortunately we don't observe the words that are in specific books, but for the most published one, of the most read one, we can have data about sales, and we can repeat our analysis doing that. Yes, I think it's a great point.
All right. Shani, you want to take it from here?